run through.
I got the recording in progress message overwhelming your voice there, Alex, but we've got, as you can see from the screen, the introduction that we've just gone through. We're going to start with Conservation Watch, a program that we've just launched over the last couple of months after the provincial government gutted the conservation authorities. We wanted to make sure that we were watching what was happening there as closely as possible and assisting the conservation authorities where we can, making sure the public knows what is happening as a result of the changes which the provincial government pushed through in December. So we're going to start with that. And I think you have some questions from that, Alex?
Yeah. So.
And then we're going to get into the Enbridge pipeline update. Let's go to the Conservation Watch. That's good.
Yeah. So Dawn, we've heard a lot about conservation authorities in the news, and we're going to get to some of these headlines on the screen in a second. But what is a conservation authority? Like, even if you don't say, for example, watch your conservation authority board, as we've started doing here in Hamilton 350, how might you kind of interact with a conservation authority just living in Ontario?
Well, there are 36 conservation authorities in Ontario. Most of them were set up in the 1940s and 1950s, so they've been around a long time. And their main mandate is to ensure limited flooding, making sure we don't have floods, and managing watersheds. So their boundaries are not political boundaries. Their boundaries are natural boundaries, the boundaries of the watersheds. So in the Hamilton area, for example, we have 4 different ones that are have jurisdiction within some parts of Hamilton. And all across Southern Ontario, you have conservation authorities. So we'll have a map up to show you where those are.
Yeah, it sounds like from what you're telling me that conservation authorities are not only a place where we can go kind of to access nature. I know a lot of folks have been doing that during COVID, and that might be our most kind of like direct relationship. But in addition to kind of this access to nature and outdoors, they're a place where important decisions are made about our ecosystem health. The water that we drink ultimately is filtered through the wetlands in our area, and keeping them healthy is important to keeping us healthy. So it probably came as a lot of shock, and indeed there was a lot of opposition when in December of 2020, so just a few months ago, the news started looking a whole lot like this, with folks on the Ontario Greenbelt Council resigning, people saying that Doug Ford's government is giving developers the power to ignore conservation authorities, and really putting forward a lot of changes that people were concerned about. Here in Hamilton, we saw the Hamilton Conservation Authority, and this is the quote at the bottom, say that they're worried that if this act was passed, it would reduce their ability to protect the natural environment and the watershed, as well as remove citizen representation. So again, some big red flags. What were some of the changes included in that legislation?
First of all, as you say, the public opposition was overwhelming. There were 45,000 emails went into the provincial government. 40 municipalities passed resolutions asking them not to do this, and all of the conservation authorities spoke out against it. So huge opposition, but it was largely ignored. And at the last minute, the provincial government changed some of the things, mostly to make it worse. So they took away from the conservation authorities the final say over permitting of projects that affect watersheds and affect the flow of lands, the flow of water through lands, and the wetlands in particular. And they've instead put that in the hands of the minister, and he can basically override anything that the conservation authorities decide. And they've put a situation like we have one in Pickering, where a wetland, provincially significant wetland, which has been protected for decades because of provincial legislation, is now suddenly being cleared for development, a warehouse development on top of a wetland. The Conservation Authority is being ordered to provide a permit. And if something goes wrong, and something is likely to go wrong if you start building on wetlands, the conservation authorities are probably the ones who are liable, and they're not happy about that, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it sounds like not only were a lot of these changes really, really concerning to those with a conservation mandate, but as you mentioned, they were all amended last minute. So even though there was limited public consultation, and even though that consultation was overwhelmingly critical, almost in the last window, a lot of proponents are saying they made it worse, and they snuck through pages upon pages of amendments. So it's a real concern.
And
And now we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about what that means for us here in Hamilton, and what we're doing with that concern, because ultimately this legislation has now passed, and is slowly in the works of being implemented.
yes, and slowly in the works of being implemented is important because they didn't put everything into force immediately. So we're going to see additional changes being brought forward throughout this year, probably.
Hmm. And I guess it's now important for folks watching to kind of know a little bit about why we watch, and why we're recommending folks from across the province who are tuning in. For example, we know we have some folks from Stratford joining us tonight. Why you maybe think about setting up a conservation watch in your neighborhood or your area. So some of the reasons why we watch is simple, as we were kind of talking about earlier. This is the place where we live, this is our home, and things like flooding. I know I live in Dundas. This is a community that already faces quite substantial flooding. Any changes to that, or worsening through the climate crisis, and just not having conservation authorities funded and resourced to prevent it, to respond to the worsening and flooding we know is coming, really makes an impact. So these things are local, and the decisions made here hit close to home, and as a result, they're public bodies. And most of us know that that means we should have some insight. If these are happening right next door, as I said, if this is impacting the flooding in our area, our access to nature, we know these are such important things held in the public good. Shouldn't we have some say in what they look like? So that's really where we're coming from. And as of course, we are in a climate crisis, and the role of conservation authorities is only going to become more important, both in mitigating that, but also in understanding its impact on our local ecosystem. John, I know specific to the pipeline we're going to talk about, Hamilton 350 was already watching some of the conservation meetings outside of this program. What was the role of watching permits there?
Well, there are two elements with respect to the pipeline. One is that a number of permits would have to have been obtained from the conservation authorities for the installation of a pipeline like the frack gas pipeline that Enbridge wanted to put through the Beverly Swamp. A second element in this case was that part of that pipeline route ran right through lands which have been purchased by the Conservation Authority and which have been guaranteed in that purchase that they would never be developed and never be bulldozed. So that was a key part of how we approached the fight against the pipeline. And I think it was a key part of why the pipeline got stopped. And we can go into that. Jim is probably going to do some of that later. But essentially, the Conservation Authority, the Hamilton Conservation Authority, took the position that they would not provide access, an easement across their land at least until the company did a full ecological assessment. And that full ecological assessment was then examined by an independent peer review. We didn't get to that point. Enbridge pulled out before that, but just before that, that process was already underway.
Yeah, and I know we're going to dive right into that earlier, but I think that really but I think that really illustrates the point that developers, people who are interested in building infrastructure through these natural areas, oftentimes just because they can make money doing it, not because there is necessarily a public good or a public interest, although it's not always clear cut, but yeah, they benefit, and they're watching conservation authorities, they're attending these meetings. So it's really important that, we're also showing up.
Exactly. And we're getting lots of threats to conservation areas and conservation authorities across the province. And it may get much worse depending on how the province decides what the core mandate is of conservation authorities. Because certainly in Hamilton, they provide all kinds of services that people participate in, educational services, recreational services, and the hints from the provincial government is they think that all of that is superfluous and shouldn't carry on.
Mm-hmm. And so could you tell us a little bit earlier you told us about the various CAs across Ontario. Could you tell us a little bit about how our CA Watch program here in Hamilton's working and what regions that we're looking at?
So if you see the square in the map there, that shows you approximately the boundaries of Hamilton, and it overlaps 4 different conservation authorities, and they're listed on the slide. The Hamilton one covers the Spencer Creek watershed and some of the smaller watersheds like Shadok. Conservation Halton picks up Bronte Creek as it flows through our area, and the Grand River Conservation Authority has jurisdiction over streams that flow out of the Hamilton area to the Grand River. And the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority covers quite a large piece of Hamilton, South Hamilton, sort of from the airport eastward, because 20 Mile Creek and the Welland River both come out of that area, and they're both under the jurisdiction of the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority. So we're watching all 4 of these.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get to later. We definitely encourage folks to get engaged and to help us out by watching maybe the Conservation Authority in your area or helping us with these 4. But we did want to share what we've learned since we started. So Dawn, I know you've been at both of the Niagara meetings. What are some things that stand out for you?
Well, the January meeting was actually the first one that we were able to see in this area after the legislation was adopted. And the main thing coming out of that for me was the people who sit on the Conservation Authority, and they're composed of both councillors and citizens representing Haldimand, Hamilton, and Niagara area. They were pretty upset. They were talking about boycotting the advisory committee, which the province quickly set up after they passed the legislation to supposedly get some input, which they didn't have beforehand. And everyone who spoke on it was clearly angry with what the province had done and clearly concerned about what that might mean. So that was the first meeting. In the second meeting, we learned that one of the additional shoes is dropped, and that is the province has now put in place the requirement that the composition of the conservation authority starting next year, the citizen input, component is now limited. So in the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, there are 20 members at this point on the board. 12 of them are citizens, and the other 8 are councillors. The regulation from the province is 70% must be from council. So automatically, if you keep that same number, 8 of those 12 citizen positions will disappear. And that's because that gets you down to 4 out of the 20 is you're within that 70% arrangement. But it's actually worse than that, because each municipality has to abide by the 70% rule. So if you have 3 members appointed to the Conservation Authority from your municipality, none of them can be citizens. Because if you make one a citizen, you only get 66% that are councillors. So the actual number of citizens on these will actually be very small. That change from no citizens to 70% councillors was one of the amendments at the end of the process. And it was apparently done to make it look better, but the effect is probably not much. And we're ending up with citizens largely being excluded from these bodies.
I know one of the things that we're also seeing when I think of the Grand River Conservation Authority, and we had some volunteers attend that one of the things that they're now announcing is that in their new budget, they're going to be running on 8% reserve funds for this coming fiscal year. And I think that's just something to talk about, as we've really underscored the importance of taking action on the climate crisis and the role of the PAs as being directly linked to climate action, whether that be protecting our wetlands and our other essential areas or growing them, places for recreation. There's just so many connections. And I think it's really concerning that we're in a situation where we have a conservation authority relying on reserve funds. So Don, how are conservation authorities funded? What does that breakdown look like?
It's different in each conservation authority, but the majority of the funding for conservation authorities comes from municipal budgets. And depending on the conservation authority, they may also have significant funds that they're generating as a result of their own activities. That is self-funding arrangements. Historically, they were primarily funded by the province, and that largely changed in the late 1990s with the previous Conservative government, Mike Harris. And for Hamilton today, 2% of the budget of the Conservation Authority, the Hamilton Conservation Authority, comes from the provincial government. So overwhelmingly, these are municipal funded organizations and self-funded organizations.
Yeah, and I can share a little bit because I actually attended the last Hamilton Conservation Authority meeting, and I think one of the real pieces here is because these conservation authorities have been established for so many decades and have been somewhat autonomous in really their role up until now. They've built these structures like Conservation Ontario, for example, advocates to the province already. And one of the things that was really clear from attending the Hamilton Conservation meeting is that the impacts of these changes, what this tangibly looks like on the ground, in a lot of ways is still up in the air. And it really, what we are seeing is that there's a lot more points for developers and other maybe privately oriented people who are saying, I want to make money off of development. I don't really care what's happening. More opportunities for them to go through the process without kind of checking these environmental concerns or without going through that process. There was an example actually talked about at the Hamilton Conservation Authority, almost a hypothetical given. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, there was a permit, a fairly small permit that normally would have been approved by staff if it met the conditions that are set out in the rules. But one of the conditions it didn't quite meet. So necessarily staff then had to bring it back to the full authority board for a final decision. They did approve it, but one of the councillors on the authority board raised the question, so if we didn't approve it, could this person have just gone to the province and gotten this permit? And the response from their staff was, yes, that's what that person could have done. So that all of the permitting process, and they issue dozens and dozens of permits for various activities to make sure that the watersheds aren't being damaged, to make sure that flooding threat is not being increased. These are now basically, anybody could go to the province instead and overrule or go right around the Conservation Authority.
And that's really concerning. It is worth noting that I believe all political parties but the Conservatives have now said that if they were to form government, they would reverse any of these permits given, or any reversals that kind of go through the Conservation Authority. So it's really, it's really tenuous seeing like really there's just clear opposition from the public. There's not a debate kind of going on. It's just transparently giving access to a different group of people. And transparently creating a way to kind of fast track these things with sidestepping environmental concerns. And you spoke a little bit about the new committee that's been made to look into these issues. Given that we're kind of worried about these decisions being made kind of in the open and having an understanding of what's going on, what stood out to you about that Halton meeting?
Well, at the Halton meeting, the CEO of Conservation Halton is one of the people on the advisory committee that's been formed by the provincial government. An advisory committee, which by the way, includes developers, which a lot of people are very upset about. So he was reporting back at the request of the board, what's going on in the advisory committee. And he gave a bit of a presentation, but the essence of the presentation was, I can't tell you, it's secret. We're sworn to secrecy. There's meetings going on and everything looks nice and that's kind of thing. You can make some general statements, but no details, no information. This is apparently the way in which the current government considers a public process should be proceeded with.
Yeah, and I know a lot of folks attending that Halton meeting were surprised. Some volunteer watchers were surprised when so much of it was in camera. Meaning that it was not accessible to the public. So even though people were showing up virtually to try and figure out what was going on, obviously there are reasons to go in camera. But it makes us wonder, are more things going to be going in camera because of the non-disclosure agreements related to this committee? So when conservation authorities do hear these updates, will we, the public, still hear them? Or how will that muzzling continue to happen? I think these questions are something we can only really learn by continuing to show up. So that concludes our quick update on what's gone on with our Conservation Watch program. At the end of this program, we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can get involved. But we really want to go into our next segment, which is looking at how we actually win some of these fights now that we know we're in such a big fight. So we're going to hear a little bit from Jim Quinn, our Dr. Jim Quinn here with Hamilton 350, about some of the 350's efforts, getting a delay or a stoppage really on the Enbridge frack gas pipeline through Beverly Swamp here in Flamborough Dundas area.
Enbridge is proposing a frack gas pipeline that will be 48 inches in diameter and 10 kilometers long.
These are areas that have been set aside specifically to be protected. The Conservation Authority documents say they will never be bulldozed. But if you're going to put a pipeline through here, they will be bulldozed.
In this age, investing in fossil fuel infrastructure is very, very reckless. This is how these companies secure their future and secure the continued use of these fossil fuels by building infrastructure projects such as this that shackle our society to these fuel sources.
Canada is already way above what their emissions should be. I've read that Enbridge plans on this pipeline being functional for 40 to 60 years. This takes us well beyond the 2030 and certainly the 2050 goal for the Paris Accord.
The lands that we're standing on here are the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples and other First Nations. And they were able to maintain these lands without damage, with clean water and clean air for thousands and thousands of years. So we really need to learn from Indigenous people, and we need to stand with them, and they have been at the front lines of all of these efforts to protect the land and to protect the water and to oppose these pipelines.
If we're using more fossil fuels and we are emitting more greenhouse gases due to that, we are going to further exacerbate the environmental problems that we're facing.
Each of these pipeline projects is crucial to expanding the fossil fuel extraction process. And each time we stop one, we stop a whole lot of damage to the environment.
So I'm going to hand it over to Jim in a second to tell us a little bit now more about this pipeline and some of Hamilton 350's efforts to intervene.
Thanks, Alex. The video that you saw just a moment ago is a video that we made simply to spread the word, to let people know what was going on, to make them aware of this proposal. Now you can see in this map, this is a base map from the City of Hamilton's official plan, and you can see this 10-kilometer long 48-inch pipeline that needs to be buried about 48 inches under the ground. So this is a deep trench required for this. It goes from the Kirkwall valve site to the Hamilton valve, and I will get into more details about this in a moment. But you'll notice if you look at the legend that this pipeline goes through key natural heritage and key hydrological feature wetlands. It also goes through greenbelt protected countryside and greenbelt natural heritage systems. Next slide, please. The proposed route comes out of the Marcellus shales in Pennsylvania. This is where it is fracked. So this is fracked natural gas, a process that is extremely dangerous in terms of emissions. There's a lot of leakage of methane, which is more powerful than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. This gas is piped out of Pennsylvania and ends up in Sarnia, crosses the border into Sarnia. Next slide.
Next step.
The next step along the way is to go to the Kirkwall valve in the area of Hamilton. So we're now in a position where this pipeline will go across to the Hamilton valve and join the Don the Don Parkway system. And that Don Parkway system carries it on further along to until it crosses the US border. Could we have the next slide, please? And it crosses the border and then services the east coast of the US. So if you look at where it came from, there's a much more direct route. This is an end run, and it's an end run around New York State because New York State has put a moratorium on these on fracked gas and fracked gas pipelines. So they're going through Ontario and through Canada to get to the East Coast. Now there's another potential use of this gas, and this has been spoken to, and we hear about plans that the Ford administration has to replace the nuclear energy when our nuclear plants have to be mothballed. There is a plan afoot to replace them with natural gas powered electrical stations. And if you think about an electrical plant that's fired, that's actually operated on natural gas, that means that our electricity, as it was in the past when we had coal-fired power plants, our electricity is going to have a huge carbon footprint associated with it. So we'll be contributing CO2 emissions when we drive electric cars, if this is the case. So obviously there are better ways. There is hydroelectricity that we could be purchasing from Quebec. There are other ways around this. Bottom line is this pipeline has a very sordid history, and it's very questionable why it should go forward. Next slide. So what have we done about it? Well, Hamilton 350's efforts included successful lobbying of the Hamilton Conservation Authority to require that full ecological study that you heard about previously, and a review of that study. We mounted a letter writing campaign to the Ontario Energy Board, and we were asking for an oral hearing to allow people to actually cross-examine the Enbridge people that were presenting, and also for the OEB to consider climate and the effect of that natural gas on climate change. The oral hearing ultimately was granted. However, unfortunately, even though this piping of natural gas is bound to have climate change implications, they denied consideration of climate impacts. We successfully lobbied Hamilton City Council to intervene in the Ontario Energy Board hearings. Hamilton and the Hamilton Conservation Authority both formally asked the OEB to consider climate in its decision-making, and as I mentioned before, they denied that request. Over 15,000 homes in Hamilton were visited, and we put flyers in the mailboxes with a flyer that was talking about this pipeline and expressing the concerns about it, and it was also addressing with the Clean Air Alliance an anti-gas-fired power station aspect. We participated in the Ontario Energy Board. Our representatives in the Green Energy Coalition and allies wrote most of the 850 odd questions that were addressed to Enbridge over this proposal. We organized and ran a Beverly Swamp bus tour, and I'm going to go forward through a few slides just to give you an idea of what people were seeing up there. We wanted people to recognize that this is a beautiful area that should not be destroyed. This is Upper Spencer Creek in the vicinity of the pipeline. I'm going to show you some pictures that are not right there where it would cross, but this pipeline has to cross Spencer Creek. So going under that creek and through these forests and this habitat is going to create destruction. Next slide, please. So there are many, many beautiful areas along that stretch, but this is a view that shows you what it looks like when a pipeline goes through these natural habitats. This is a Union gas pipeline. It's very close to the proposed Enbridge one. So imagine an 8-lane highway being put through a forest like this. It's going to wipe out a lot of habitat. If I go to the next slide, you'll see that for some of these areas within Beverly Swamp, even though it's a swamp, next slide, please. You can see in the bottom of this picture, bedrock showing up. And this happens also on the route of the Enbridge pipeline. So in order to put this pipeline through 48 inches down, below the surface, a 48-inch diameter pipeline, there's going to be significant blasting done. And this blasting is going to probably have impacts on where the water in the area is flowing. So there are concerns about that as well. Next slide. There are also species like this. This is a species of special concern in Ontario, the monarch butterfly. There are other species that are listed that may be living in these areas along this pipeline, and both their habitat and individuals along the route of this pipeline may be harmed by this project. Now, in early May, next slide, please. In early May, there was a deadline for answering the 850 questions that were put forward. And just before that deadline was due, Enbridge asked for a stay. So they asked for a little bit of a break so that they could, I guess, so they could collect their thoughts and answer these questions. And these questions included things like, what's going to happen when this pipeline goes through? Is there going to be more flooding in Dundas? And that could be both the disruption of the water table through putting the pipeline through. It could also be the contribution of that pipeline and the natural gas that was going to be burned to climate change. They also wondered, why are Ontarians expected to have increased gas rates so that they can pay some in the range of $120 million as a share in the pipeline? So why are we paying for this? What are the risks? How much habitat is being lost? So about 5 months after that stay, we received this letter from Enbridge, and this letter is a notice of withdrawal. This notice of withdrawal refers to the pandemic, saying that that Enbridge has determined there is no longer a need for the project in the time frame as originally proposed. Therefore, they withdraw their application. Next slide, please. So in this case, for now, we win. We have succeeded in deflecting this application for the time being, and we're happy about that. So we view this as a victory in the sense that any delay that we can put to pipelines reduces their chances of ever being successfully built, because as we know, people are more and more aware of the consequences of putting in pipelines. A pipeline that would last as long as this one would last would require the pumping and the burning of natural gas into the future, contributing to CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. So we need you. We need people in the community to help out. Educate yourself if you aren't already aware of this stuff. Speak out. Comment on things like the fact that Enbridge is out there looking for a chance to put this pipeline through. Meanwhile, we have an Ontario provincial government that is putting forward all of these ministerial zoning orders that allow them to sidestep any assessments. And we have 400 level highways being constructed through habitats like this. We need you to educate yourselves and speak out. We need to support our conservation authorities. We need to get their power back. We need people to help us probe the pipeline effects on species and habitats in the upper Spencer Creek area. We need people to volunteer to help with on-the-ground surveys. We'd like to get out there and dig in and look for rare habitats and look for species that we need to protect. And we need help to review Enbridge's ecological assessments because they are probably very flawed. So if you are able, please contact us. The contact is on the screen there. If you're able, get in touch and we'll reach out to you and try to get your help. Thank you very much.
And yeah, before we jump too far in to our next segment, I really do want to just thank you, Jim, because I think it's really important to see both how when we as a community organize, we can get the result we're looking for. But also I think you brought up an incredibly important flag. What happens when we see this provincial government moving MZOs that allow these decisions to be made without community consent? What should we be worried about? And could you tell us just a little bit more about, so where would we see the first signs of something like that? Would it be at the Conservation Authority? Where would we kind of get that information about what's happening next?
Well, it would seem to me that with the changes that the government is making, that with the Bill 229 and Schedule 6, that the Conservation Authority no longer has the power that it once had. Its permitting it can be forced on it. So if the province wants to put this pipeline through so that they can have their gas plants, I presume they will just tell the Conservation Authority that they are obligated to give the permits to allow the pipeline through. We're seeing examples of this, and we'll talk more about this later, but in Duffins Creek, where there's a beautiful, important wetland near Pickering and Ajax, where MZO is in place to allow a warehouse to be placed in the middle of a wetland. Outrageous. The province knows better than that. The province recognizes that wetlands are in decline, that they're few and far between, and we need them for their ecosystem services. It's very important.
Mhm. And what did 350 ask for once the Enbridge did pull out? What are we looking at moving forward? And how can people kind of increase those asks and put momentum behind them?
Well, I think what we're trying to do is prepare for the possible inevitability of Enbridge coming back. And so all of the little points that you see on this screen right here have to do with building an argument, building a case against this. We need to try to do that. We need to be prepared in this case. And we also need to stem the damage being done by this Ontario provincial government. And we need to see that there is not a repeat performance, that the Ford administration does not get reelected. It's very important to prevent that.
Absolutely. And I guess one last question for you. You mentioned blasting through bedrock could change the hydrology of the region. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your concerns are there and what you're looking for?
So this is a swamp. A swamp being, just for those that don't know exactly what a swamp is, it's a wetland that has trees. So if you were to walk along the line of this proposed pipeline, you would be seeing areas with rich in various wildlife like wood frogs and various other species, and you would see a lot of water. It's also an area of drumlin. So there are places where it goes up. There's some topography here. And there are also places where the bedrock emerges and it's fairly close to the water table. At least it sure seems that way to me. And if you're going to dig a pipeline that has to be 48 inches times 2 in depth, it seems to me that that's likely to drain water away from certain areas and lead the water to other areas. That, combined with the increased likelihood of very extreme rainstorm events and so on, is likely to lead to problems that may be faced downstream of Spencer Creek and some of the other creeks that are in this watershed, leading to flooding, potentially flooding. And now we have a situation where our conservation authorities have less power to oversee this and try to protect the people of Dundas and people downstream in general.
Yeah, it seems abundantly clear that these things have an impact right here. And not only that, it seems abundantly clear that the climate crisis and climate change needs to have a bearing on how we make these decisions, whether they be future pipeline proposals or whatever we're planning. Dawn, I'm going to throw it to you. You'll just have to unmute yourself, though.
Thank you. We're now going to go to a segment that we promised here on another successful battle, this one directly against the Ministerial Zoning Order and interference by the provincial government, but also some shenanigans by local government in Stratford. And we were able last week to interview 2 of the key players who were involved in successfully fighting this project, a float glass plant. We talked to Susan McSherry from the Wellington Water Watchers, and this plant had been thrown up as a proposal in Guelph Aramosa first and got beaten there by Wellington Water Watchers and then turned up in Stratford. And we talked also to Mike Sullivan, and Mike is with a group called Get Concerned Stratford, which was formed specifically to fight this, and which in a matter of 3 months is celebrating victory. So this is a recorded, and I'm doing the interviewing, but thank you very much to both of them for their contributions and being willing to sit down and explain to us what happened there. So I think we can go straight into the interview now. We got to get some sound there.
A local activist who asked if I had heard of it, and I looked it up, discovered what I found was a pretty big, going to be a pretty big issue, and I wrote an op-ed to the local paper. Does Stratford need a glass factory? And as by chance, that op-ed came out on the weekend that the city announced it was holding public consultations on a Tuesday, where I registered, as did a whole bunch of other people. And in the meantime, Susan of Get Concerned was contacted as well, because people knew that the town of Guelph Hermosa had successfully stopped this. And Susan also advised us that the Wellington Water Watchers were a big part of having to deal with this issue. And so in the course of about 3 or 4 days, I found out more than I needed ever to know about it, and found out who all these wonderful people were that eventually became Get Concerned with Stratford.
Hermosa situation, like the Stratford situation, the residents of the municipality woke up one morning to be surprised by a media announcement that Xinyi would be building a massive float glass plant. And there had been no public consultation. It was being supposed to be erected on farmland and was going to have a 300-foot smokestack with all kinds of emissions that nobody was really sure what was what. And they were going to have to use up to 1.5 million liters of water every day. There was, so little information, and the company wasn't providing much information, and it was the same planning organization, GSB, that was involved in both the Guelph Hermosa and Stratford situations. Long story short, we managed to remind the municipality that there were zoning bylaws which did not, that covered dry use only in that area, which meant that technically Xinyi was way above the mass of water, the volume of water that needed any kind of definition of dry use. But the council was finally willing to uphold the bylaw, and Xinyi was outed. So that worked. And then late October, early November, got a call from Sharon Collingwood, who was ultimately on Get Concerned Stratford steering committee. Shortly thereafter, by Melissa Verspieten, who was also eventually took over the one of the lead roles for the steering committee in Stratford. And we learned that there'd been a lot of shady goings on, lots of things that had happened, requests for MZO, up to 1.5 million liters of water every day. There was, so little information, and the company wasn't providing much information, and it was the same planning organization, GSB, that was involved in both the Guelph Hermosa and Stratford situations. Long story short, we managed to remind the municipality that there were zoning bylaws which did not, that covered dry use only in that area, which meant that technically Xinyi was way above the mass of water, the volume of water that needed any kind of definition of dry use. But the council was finally willing to uphold the bylaw, and Xinyi was outed. So that worked. And then late October, early November, got a call from Sharon Collingwood, who was ultimately on Get Concerned Stratford steering committee. Shortly thereafter, by Melissa Verspieten, who was also eventually took over the one of the lead roles for the steering committee in Stratford. And we learned that there'd been a lot of shady goings on, lots of things that had happened, requests for MZOs, where they, the government of Ontario was told that there had been public consultation when there really had not been. The annexation of farmland, which had happened very quickly and being directly influenced by Xinyi. Xinyi was very much pestering the municipality for an MZO because they had had closed doors meetings with Doug Ford. And the mayor started to write letters requesting an MZO within months of the Guelph-Massa situation coming to a resolution. This led to other political issues and potential conflict of interest. It led to questions about how things were going because there was a lot of secrecy in Stratford municipality and very little information being shared because of signed letters of intent. And we realized that the people of Stratford, the residents of Stratford, really had not been given any decent amount of information. And again, the more digging that was done and the more documentation that was revealed by both people on the steering committee and the people in Stratford who got very, very involved and did some tremendous digging and research to reveal documents that became very helpful. The whole thing, and on top of that, with this MZO being imposed under really fraudulent conditions, that there was no way the municipality could carry on in good faith, talking about a cost sharing agreement, a $6 million cost sharing agreement with Xinyi. And so everything went into slow motion and then sort of went very quiet until Xinyi announced that it was going to suspend indefinitely plans to build there. And I think that this was, as somebody on the steering committee has said before, the way sort of the city found a graceful exit, and Xinyi was left holding nothing, but still looking for a home.
There's a couple of things I want to ask about that. One is there's obviously a role here that the provincial government played by providing a ministerial zoning order in MZO. And that was at the request of the mayor of Stratford, but it is the key piece because it means that you can't do any, there's no requirement for any public process once that MZO is issued.
Essentially, the municipality wanted to circumvent the planning process, the rightful planning process, and impose this MZO, which would have stopped any public consultation or any of the significant requirements of normal planning process, which you have heard about and seen and know. So yes, it was a misuse of an MZO, but the Ford government is using MZOs willy-nilly, and we're all seeing this.
And that's certainly one of the things that we've seen in Hamilton as well, and we're seeing them happening in other parts of the province. I think there's been about 40 issued so far by the Ford government. Very unusual in use of that long-standing process, but very rarely used in the past.
And Don, you should say something here because he interviewed the Stratford mayor several times. He spoke with the Randy Pettipies, the MPP, and Mr. Nader, the MP, about this entire situation and has insight to offer.
This Xinyi was, I'm beginning to think, because they were turned down in Guelph-Massa, they kind of looked for how do we avoid getting turned down in the next town, and came up with the idea of an MZO in this circumstance. And it was they that put the idea of the MZO into the head of the mayor. And this was probably the first instance of this government getting the idea of an MZO for regular zoning process. I don't believe, I think if it had been issued back in September or November of 2018 when it was first asked for. It would have been the first one of many now. So it was being asked for by the mayor as a result of Xinyi saying to the mayor, we don't want any public consternation here. Just give us a ministerial zoning order, and then you won't have to worry, and you'll get your plan.
Followed a behind closed doors meeting with Doug Ford, which happened immediately after Xinyi was turned down in Guelph Massa.
So Xinyi and its planner lobbied both Ford and Minister Clark directly, and in doing so violated the integrity of the lobbying regime in Ontario because they did not register as lobbyists, they just lobbied. So back, why we found out about this stuff was because the mayor and the minister were pointing fingers at one another over whose fault was the MZO. The mayor was trying to leave the town with the impression that, oh gee, this MZO came out of the sky, I didn't expect it, because nobody had seen his letters. So as soon as he said that, the ministry issued the letters that he'd written and said, whoa, wait a minute, he asked for it. It wasn't us, they wanted it. And in fact, as a result of an FOI, we now have a bunch more letters back and forth in which the ministry first turned it down in March of 2020, and then turned it down again in April of 2020. And both times the mayor wrote petulant letters seeking the MZO, saying, we have to have this, we have to have this. And in one of those letters, the ministry said, use the regular planning process. Now, if they'd started with the regular planning process back in September of 2018, they'd have been done long ago. And it would have been very, very difficult for the public to actually do anything about it. So they did not, they chose not to. They signed a non-disclosure agreement with Xinyi. They signed 2 letters of intent with Xinyi that we found out because the city admitted it on their own website, not because they released them, just that they admitted it. And then these letters, which show that it was the city that was seeking the MZO, not the minister. In our conversations then with the MPP, he reiterated that, hey, it's not my fault. You guys asked for it. And but if you don't want it, all council has to do is ask the minister to revoke it, and he'll revoke it. No questions asked. Okay, so that's what's happening next, is that one of the councillors is putting forward a motion to ask the minister to revoke the MZO.
So that would finish the task of stopping this thing.
Right, and they technically, because they have their MZO, they have the zoning they need. All that's in the way is the site plan agreement and the cost sharing agreement. And the cost sharing agreement is what made it have to be public, because the cost sharing agreement was not something they could hide in a closed door meeting. They actually, because they're going to be spending taxpayer dollars, they had to actually come out of the closet, as it were, and talk publicly about spending $6 million of Stratford's money to assist a float glass manufacturer get water and sewer services. So what riled the public here, what got people to be so vociferous, it wasn't just that they didn't want a glass plant. They were pissed about the process, really pissed about the process. Like 2.5 years of working in secret. And so the secrecy is what galvanized the community to be upset. And then in dribs and drabs, we found out more and more about the organization of Xinyi Glass. They are a Cayman Islands company with all the directors being corporations in the British Virgin Islands. So if anything ever happens, once they've built it here, you can't go after anybody for compensation because they're hidden behind corporations in the British Virgin Islands. We found on, sometimes in Mandarin, and we had people helping us with the Mandarin, stuff on Xinyi's websites in China that indicated how little they were going to be paying people here, because they were telling their investors how little the labor costs would be way lower than the fellow from GSP suggested they were going to pay. They steadfastly refused, when specifically asked by the city, how much greenhouse gases will this plant emit? They refused to say. And we know roughly how much it was going to be. It's going to be about 1.5 times as much as the entire city of Stratford now emits. And so that fact got some wavering councillors to be upset. We didn't need to do a whole lot more. They were phoning the mayor and the councillors to the point where the councillors had to turn off their phones. They literally would not answer their phones anymore because they knew it was going to be about this. We printed a bunch of lawn signs and put them up, and then ran out and had to print more, and ran out again and had to print more. People wanted these things; they wanted to show their upset. So ultimately, in my, several things worked in concert to make this happen. One was the secrecy. Two was the kind of hidden cloak of corporate hiding that the company was in. Three was the cost that was going to happen, but I warned, get concerned, don't focus on the cost, because Xinyi will come up with that $6 million in a heartbeat if that's your only issue. The real issue is, do we want this in Stratford? People started to wonder, Stratford is a festival town. Does this make us a glass town instead? Because the size, when you look at the physical size of this factory, it dwarfs anything that's already existent in Stratford. It's the size of a fairly large auto manufacturing plant. Nothing in Stratford anywhere near that. Stratford only has 32,000 people. So this was going to be big. And the fifth thing was a wonderful organizational capacity of the Wellington Water Watchers and the people who come with get concerned from Welfare Mosa. They knew their way around organizing like no tomorrow. It was great. And being COVID, lots of people signed up for Zoom meetings. Don't have to go out public. We had 600 people at Zoom meetings.
What other kinds of things do you think were innovative there that other people might want to pick up when they encounter an MZO in their community?
I think this engaged public who were not only making the phone calls and writing emails and sending letters and making phone calls to neighbors and taking lawn signs and showing up at Wise Communities in Stratford had rallies, and in fact they had another one today which Mike spoke at. One of the things in making sure that the public was engaged and energized and involved. The website was another tool that was used effectively by both Get Concerned Stratford and the people of Stratford. And also there was this amazing pamphlet that was sent out to, was it 17,000 people, residents of Stratford? Leslie and Peggy, who organized the vigil, were people who truly believed that this kind of lack of transparency and secrecy and a very corrupted process was not acceptable, and that they needed to make a physical presence to make sure that people, passersby, the municipality, the government, knew that people were not taking this for granted, were not going away, were not disappearing. And they showed up in some of the coldest weather we've had, day after day, for I think it was 36 days in a row, educating, talking, making their presence known. And they were very effective because you couldn't run away from seeing them. They were right on the steps of City Hall and right in the Market Square area of Stratford. And they were phenomenally good. But I think we also had, I think it was 7 public meetings on Zoom. And as Mike said, they were well attended, and both by all parties, business people. The small businesses, I think, got overlooked for a long time, and then they started to show up by people that really spoke to the breadth of interests and work and focus in this incredibly creative and capable city. And it was just a phenomenal thing. They were supportive both in terms of presence and in terms of finance and in terms of energy to ensure, do whatever it took to stop this.
Another of the things that we did was we held public meetings outdoors in spite of COVID. So these were rallies, an hour long, limited to 100 participants. So you had to register, and if there were more than 100, you couldn't come. You had to walk around the street. And Lorena McKenna, who is a force to be reckoned with in Stratford, she's quite a famous singer-songwriter, started her own organization called Wise Communities, which has existed for some time. And her focus at first was the lack of democracy, the lack of transparency. And she organized these rallies that 100 people showed up at. Even when COVID was such that we couldn't have more than 10 people, she organized a rally of boots, where she put boots on the square with little signs in them saying no to Xinyi, and held a rally anyway. And what those public things did was gave us a focus for the press. And they were like, for any of the groups out there that are looking to try and change what happens, don't underestimate the power of the press. It's very powerful, and they're looking for good news stories with people in them. They want shots of people. So the Vigilistas became the focus of several of the stories, which was a testament to their doggedness and determination in the spite of the cold. When people suggested to me that somebody should do a vigil, I went, I'm not standing on the cold.
Anything else that either of you would like to add to that I haven't asked a question about, but that you think would be helpful or informative?
I think that in addition to engaging and maintaining the energy and interest of the public, we also reached out. We had an outreach, a couple of outreach meetings with members of the public that members of the steering committee who lived in Stratford recommended names of people who should be invited to attend that particular Zoom meeting. And it was again a cross section of people, and we listened to them as well. I mean, the importance of engaging the public can never be underestimated. And I think what Mike is saying about don't underestimate the power of the press is absolutely right, because the fact that we've had both local news organizations, radio, television, newspaper, and then we got national coverage by the Toronto Star, really just kept the issue, exactly where we wanted it to be. It was always simmering. And the other element which I've not mentioned, there is something to be said about engaging an environmental lawyer like David Donnelly, who truly knows his stuff. He supports grassroots organizations, and I don't think grassroots organizations can ever be underestimated either. And he was with us all the way. And in this instance, he wrote some letters and had some conversations which were ultimately shown to be very helpful.
Well, one of the things that ironically probably would be very helpful is that the secrecy and the refusal to go through a process was trumped by what the opposition did, because you did the public consultation that was being denied through the MZO.
Yes, we also had help from like the NDP in Queen's Park. I mean, they raised questions which needed to be asked, and so the issue was being raised both on a community level, on a political level, and that was key, because we had people in our corner who might not necessarily have lived in the community, but knew the kind of issues that were being raised by this.
So thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much to Mike and Susan for sharing in that interview, Dawn. Is there anything you just kind of want to share with us before we move into our next segment, Dawn, from there?
Well, like Susan was saying, Mike was saying there, this isn't quite final yet, because the council has to actually formally ask for withdrawal of the Ministerial Zoning Order, and that has to happen. But really it looks like it's dead. I'm noticing in the chat, lots of folks making comments from obviously from Stratford, adding to the knowledge that was shared by Susan and Mike. And we have Mike going to join us for a panel in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, and so what I'm going to do is, because we've already gone a little bit over time, I'm just going to kind of let you know what we'll be sending you in the following, then we'll move into our panel, which we have some questions for, and then we'll kind of just open it up as well. So some of the things upcoming, and we have a resource sheet that you'll get over email in the next day or two. But some of the things coming up are Duffins Creek, like Stratford, also has an MZO. This one's to build a warehouse on the Duffins Creek wetland complex. This is one of the last wetlands in the Pickering Ajax community, and it is quite significant in terms of ecological area to the greater system. So I think the community is very rightfully asking, why are you putting a warehouse on our wetland? There's nowhere else it can go of the provincial government. So yeah, they're running the Say No to MZOs, Stop the Developers. They have a Save Don't Pave campaign going on. And most relevant here is this Saturday, March 6th at 1:30 p.m. there is a march and demonstration, and we heard from Mike about how important that was in Stratford and how it was done safely with COVID in mind. So folks can take this information. There's also going to be an interview with Bill McKibben, and of course an update on the 413 and the Bradford bypass. We have some zombie highways coming back with this provincial government that have previously been killed, but it seemed to be brought back. So the Bradford bypass is having a federal environmental assessment done after a community asked for this. So that's another win that's happening in Ontario when people kind of reach out and are demanding. There are some wins, and we'll hopefully see the details from that.
Just one piece to update that earlier today, the city of Vaughan voted to no longer support the 413 highway. It had originally endorsed it. It reversed its position earlier today or yesterday afternoon, I believe. So that's another big hit against that highway project that Doug Ford has revived, as you say, from the dead.
Yeah, and of course, we have lots going on with conservation authorities, MZOs, and here are some petitions that we're going to be sending your way. Some folks were saying that they work and they're just not sure how much time they have in the chat. Getting your email out there and like saying that, yeah, I'm one of these people that believe in this is certainly, certainly an easy way to engage on these issues. We hope you'll at least stay in the loop and tune back in next month to stay informed. But one of the ways to take action is that as well. And this is just, for example, if you're going to join our Conservation Watch program, and again, you just get in touch with 350 if you're interested about starting your own or joining ours. But here are some of the upcoming conservation authorities we're going to be attending, including Hamilton Conservation Authorities meeting tomorrow. If you're interested in what's going on there, the Hamilton 350 Twitter account will be live tweeting that Conservation Authority meeting as we did with the last one. So we're going to send you all of this. But if you really if you want to get in touch, please use the hamilton350.volunteers@gmail.com or the info@hamilton350.org to get in more engaged with these initiatives. And with that, I'm really excited to be opening our panel. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing for a moment. Oh, there we go. The more familiar Zoom is back. And yeah, so tonight we've heard about how Doug Ford and Donna Skelly's provincial changes are impacting our conservation authorities. They're creating confusion and uncertainty. We've heard firsthand from those on the ground how in Stratford and in Hamilton, rallying together and organizing with neighbors, folks were able to successfully push back against this government's pro-developer agenda. So now we're going to dive in deeper with our panel to explore how these issues are connected and what that means for how we respond. On our panel tonight, and then if you could just kind of unmute yourself and say hi once I say your name. We have Ruth Pickering.
Hi, glad to be here with everybody.
Hi, Ruth. We also have Mike Sullivan.
Hi, everybody.
And Brody Robinmeyer.
Hi, everybody. Good evening.
Hello, and thank you all for joining us. So as Dawn, why don't you ask the first question?
Because you've got them in front of you and I don't.
Oh, okay, well then wonderful. So to Mike, Brody, and Ruth, a common thread that we've seen in everything we've looked at tonight is the role of the provincial government. The decisions we've seen are deeply unpopular, whether they were CAs or changes to conservation authorities or the use of minister zoning orders. And the pushback is both huge and growing. So why do you think the government is choosing to make such deeply unpopular decisions? And Ruth, why don't we start with you?
Well, there have been some investigative reporting on that question, and a number of big developers have donated money to Ford's political campaigns, and many of those people also are now plowing up our landscape or wanting to do that. So I think there is a bit of a connection between the Ford government pro industry and pro big business and corporations, and a lack of any attention to the public good.
Thank you for that, Ruth. Mike, why do you think the government's doing what they're doing?
Because they think they can get away with it. It's simple as that. I don't think they think that it will cause a change in the electorate enough to change them to lose seats. What they're discovering recently is that in Stratford in particular, and now in Witchert, Stouffville, and other places, it's farmers who are starting to raise the flags to say, wait a minute, we're losing too much arable land, we're losing too much farmland. And it's rural Ontario that in large measure put the Conservative government in place. And it's those kinds of voters that they have to be very, very careful of. Farmers are also extremely environmentally conscious, but it's not, so far, the provincial government has not offended them that way yet. It's coming. They have offended the niceties of a lot of what's going on, and they are going to run afoul of the very organizations like the Ontario Farm Association and all the county farm associations. And don't discount those people. They are actually, while they may be traditional conservative voters, they are also very environmentally conscious. And those people are going to, and have already started to rail against some of this. I'm reminded too that when we were talking about the conservation authorities, the conservation authorities got a lot of their power after the largest natural disaster to befall Ontario ever, which was Hurricane Hazel in 1954. And Doug Ford's riding is where that disaster happened. And 81 people died and 4,000 people were left homeless. And his riding is bounds the Humber River. It's just incredibly ironic that he is decimating the very group whose organizations were set up to prevent that kind of a disaster in the future. We're never again going to have a Hurricane Hazel. If he takes away the power from if he is successful in taking away the power from the conservation authorities that we gave them to protect us from massive amounts of rainfall, climate change is here, and we're going to have those massive amounts of rainfall and no conservation authority to protect us, and there will be floods, and there will be damage, and there will be death. And I think the Ford government is responsible for too much death already.
Absolutely. Brody, anything you want to add?
I'm not sure what's going on through their mind. I think those are really good points that were raised already. I think part of the issue with the government as well is that these are folks who I think may have lost touch with some of their fundamental connections to the natural world, and a lack of appreciation for the reliance upon it. Concept I was just introduced to recently was a One Health kind of perspective. The health of the land, the ecosystem, the people. It's not as if you can just kind of pick and choose and separate them so easily. And I think that might be happening in the heads of some of these politicians.
Thank you for that.
One more thing that I would add to that, if I could, Alex, is we saw before the last election that Mr. Ford had met with a group of major developers in Ontario, Developers Association, and somebody videotaped it and released it. And in that meeting, he had said he was going to open up the Greenbelt so the developers could cash in on the lands that they've speculated on. As soon as that came out, and a huge public uproar, he ran for cover on it and said he was never going to open the greenbelt. But the kinds of things he's doing now are exactly attacks on the same values and qualities, and decimating the conservation authorities is not going to be good for the greenbelt. The Greenbelt Council, as a result, largely resigned in protest over it. So we have a picture that is coming into focus over and over again, that this government is more committed to a handful of big developers than it is to the public.
Mm-hmm. And I guess my question for folks here on our panel tonight is, why do you think people are fighting? Like, what's different? Because in many ways, the first thing this Ford government did was they ripped up cap and trade. They've been tearing out electric vehicle charging stations, fired the environmental commissioner. Don, as you mentioned, these changes are largely what Ford told us he is going to do. So what do you think is unique about right now, this moment we found ourselves in these past couple of months? Yeah, Mike, is there anything you want to touch on there? Why are people pushing back now?
Well, I think it's people are pushing back because more people are affected by these decisions than ever before. When it was a few charging stations, not that many people own electric cars, it didn't affect them. When it was cap and trade, nobody understood it anyway, and so it didn't affect them. But when it becomes getting rid of conservation authorities, every family in Ontario has had a picnic in a conservation authority. That's what they know. That's what they think. And the fact that those conservation authorities protect them is an unknown, but it's becoming more known. And so those are the kinds of things that are riling up people. And I don't think he counted on that. And I think the fact that they are backpedaling now on some things, like expanding the green belt, is a kind of backpedal. They have realized the folly of their ways to a certain extent. We'll see how much that backpedal goes on. And don't forget that the MZO issue was started by the Liberals, because they're the ones that watered down the legislation in 2017 that made it possible for, up until that point, an MZO could be challenged in front of the OMB. And the Liberals took away the right to challenge. And then the province discovered, oh, this is fun. I like doing this. And so they did it with abandon.
And taking your answer, Mike, and kind of taking that to Ruth and Brody now, a lot of folks in the chat are talking about how the climate crisis really impacts that. So when we're thinking about how maybe these changes feel closer to home, and that's why people are getting engaged, when you incorporate the climate crisis into that, Ruth or Brody, what potential do you really see here in getting organized and getting engaged on these issues here in Hamilton, but in a broader sense as well?
One of the things I've been thinking about lately, and really thinking about that question, why now? Why are people concerned about Stratford and Pickering and Hamilton and so on? And I think it's that this is more to home. This is more our home. And we do visit the conservation areas, and we know that other people and our neighbors and our friends and our family and other communities also have conservation authorities and so it's sort of like it's right in our backyards. And especially in the pandemic, people have no place to go. That's nature, except the conservation areas and a few parks and things. And so I think that the pandemic is revealing some of these things, as well as the fact that people are recognizing that their own homes are their broader homes, the natural environment in which we live. And I think that's contributing to the interest and the engagement.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, Brody, we're hearing a lot about like home in this. Is there something you want to kind of touch on as to why now, and this kind of idea of home and what we can do with that?
Sure, Alex. I genuinely, I'm not sure why now. Dynamic that I think I'm picking up on, though, is that this global pandemic, I think, has provided a sort of space, at least for some people, a kind of event that has made it such that people are thinking about the future and what is it, what kind of future are we moving towards? And having an event that's brings into such sharp relief, you know, a change from 1 month to the next where things are locked down. I think that's something that people are actually thinking about in a new way, or has provided a new frame of reference in terms of like, where are we, what is our future actually going to be like, and how do we imagine that to be, and how would we achieve that? And I think this government is showing its lack of imagination, or the imagination that it has is kind of leading us to somewhere that doesn't seem like it's going to be that fulfilling, because of some of the preconceptions I think that they're operating under. And I mean, I think all of you have probably heard this before, because I recognize I'm on the call with quite accomplished, active individuals, is that, I mean, this idea of like rushing back to a normal and these kind of market-driven standards and all this sort of stuff. I mean, I think a lot of us recognize that these sorts of thinkings and like these kind of strategies for development are in part what led us to this point right now. And it doesn't seem likely that we're going to be using the same tired strategies that have kind of bitten us before to get to somewhere new, or to at least find some kind of relationship with the natural world that's going to sustain us and give us fulfillment.
Thank you so much for that, Brody. I think that really hits home for a lot of people. And on that idea of kind of a future, my last question for our panel tonight before we go to the audience is on this idea of, you know, what is the future that we're really trying to build? I think a lot of these movements have been structured around pushing back against an MZO or pushing back against a pipeline. But what are we pushing for? We've heard from Mike a little bit about community consent and real community engagement. So Mike, in under 30 seconds, and I'll give Ruth and Brody the same kind of 30 seconds, what's your we're fighting for?
We're fighting for a world without climate change, number one. Number two, fighting for a political system that is open and transparent for real, so that we know what is being done. And number three, fighting for an engaged and enlightened citizenry. Like, people don't always understand what it means, what climate change means, and they need to be told. They need to have it explained in a way that makes sense.
Thank you for that, Mike. Brody, your vision for the future. What are we fighting for?
That is something that I'm asking myself frequently. I'm not sure, and I would also kind of at times I draw issue with the term fighting, because I mean, I think probably a lot of you could relate to this. I'm tired of fighting. I don't want to fight. I would like to get to a place where our relationship with each other and with the world that we exist in, like our food, our water, all sorts of these things. I would hope that we can find a place where we have more balance, and I'd really hope where we could get fulfillment and kind of stop getting so in the way of ourselves with some of these kind of tired thought processes or patterns.
Thank you. I think those are some really important reflections. Ruth?
I'm in this predominantly for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, and whether I fight pipelines or watch conservation authorities, all of these things are really important for us to move not only through the pandemic, but also through the climate change crisis that we're in. And I think we have to support the youth because it's their world that we're destroying. And I think that for me, I'm very happy to be involved working locally rather than just fighting the Trans Mountain Pipeline all the time.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who's jumped on tonight, who's participated in our panel, the folks who we had a chance to catch up with. We are really excited because I think we need to be having these conversations and drawing connections between these issues. And we're seeing that even though media coverage has picked up due to the work of local organizers, some on this call, these connections really aren't being made. We're not seeing the kind of the direct impact of the climate crisis in particular, waiting on these conversations. We're not talking about what the role of conservation authorities will need to be in the next 5-10 years to make a livable future, let alone a decent one. So I'm really, really happy for everyone tonight for trying this with us. And we'd love to open it up now to hear from you. And Steph, are you able to help with kind of some of the logistics of that?
Absolutely. So hi, everybody. Alex introduced me earlier and I waved at you guys, but I wasn't speaking. I've been typing away in the chat and coordinating that with you, and I've come to got a couple people on board to ask questions to the panel. So I'm going to start with Stan. Let me see now if I lost what I was going to say.
Knew you were going to say that. I don't have any of my questions written in front of me.
There it is. Yes. That would be great, Stan. Stan had a couple of really fantastic questions. So if you want to take the floor, that's great.
Okay, let me look for them.
One that I thought was really great was about conservation authorities being able to do anything with 229 and 6 handcuffing them.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, with Schedule 6 of Bill 229 and MZOs, you know, overriding conservation authorities' mandates as well. Are the abilities of the CAs that handcuffed that they won't be able to do anything? Is there anything they can do? Any options that they have that they can still do their jobs, even though they're handcuffed like they're going to be?
Let me try a quick answer to that. Yes, I think there are a number of things they can do. And one of the key parts is that they don't like what's happened and they're resisting it. The more times we run into, we can identify the situations where the provincial changes are causing harm, the more likely we are to be able to strengthen that resistance and extend it into the public. The Hamilton Conservation Authority, for example, owns 11,000 acres of land in the Spencer Creek watershed. That's our playground in terms of, and that's our ecological reserve, and that's our flood mitigation process. One of the things that HCA is doing in Hamilton, it started it a couple of years ago, and it's heading into construction work now, is creating or restoring a wetland in Upper Stony Creek for the specific purposes of reducing the flood threat to Lower Stony Creek. So the conservation authorities have some possibilities within that, and that seems to fall within this core mandate that the province is talking about of trying to reduce flooding. Okay. So there are definitely steps that they could take in those directions. For our next webinar, I think we're going to be able to, one of them soon, we're going to be able to have someone from the Hamilton CA come in and talk to us about the work that they're doing to increase the number of wetlands rather than this process that the province is doing of building over top of them.
Can I ask one more question in terms of that? Would it be possible to get one of the current citizen reps on the CA board or whatever that, you know, are threatened to become like a dinosaur and get their input as to what they actually do, how they feel about the process with citizen engagement?
I think that's a good idea, and we're, you know, all 4 of the conservation authorities that have some jurisdiction in Hamilton have some citizen reps on it. The HCA has 6 out of their 11 members are citizens. As I said, in the NPCA, it's 12 out of 20, and there's quite a few on the Halton one as well. And the Grand River one I'm less familiar with because there's so many municipalities that the Grand River covers. It covers 38 municipalities, so it may be harder to get citizens there. But that's been the practice in the past, to put citizens on there, and they played a major role. And the conservation authorities members who are city councilors have, all of them virtually that I've seen, have been speaking out saying, we need those citizens on here. They're important. They play a significant role. So yes, adding a conservation authority citizen board member certainly would be helpful to a discussion like this.
For sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
so much, Stan. Those were great questions, and you had more. So if you have the time to stick around after the meeting ends, we're going to have an open discussion.
Oh, for sure. I'm good. I'm good for about another half hour.
Cool. We're going to move on to Agnes for now because she also had a question, but we'll come back to you later on for sure. Agnes, if you're comfortable unmuting microphone there, you had a really some question too that I'd love for you to share.
Okay, I'm good. Hi, Dawn. Hi, Ruth. And hi to anyone else that I know. My question had to do with trying to take on the provincial government head on. Is there any mechanism for a vote of confidence when a party has a majority? Is there a way to call for a referendum, a citizens referendum on this issue, these issues?
You want to tackle that one, Alex?
I can, but we have a former parliamentarian on the call. Mike, I might let you do the honors.
I lived through 4.5 years of being on the wrong side of a majority government, and there isn't anything. When the Liberals were in power, the Conservatives talked a game about citizen referendums, but once they took over, it's not anything that's on their agenda, and there are no such mechanisms in our parliamentary democracy. It's a system whereby the majority rules, and the majority of the House is a Conservative body, and as long as they all stay Conservative and vote with their party, we have to wait until 2022.
It's unfortunate because the Conservatives also ran on against the Kathleen Wynne government, talking about her cronyism and all that money that she was pumping into her friends. Interesting.
Yeah.
I think there's a more optimistic side to this answer question as well. And that's what happened in Stratford. And that's what's happening in municipal councils across the province. The decision by Vaughan today to eliminate their support for the 413, the decision by Brampton and Mississauga to ask for a federal environmental assessment of those highways. And they're not alone, several others have done it. So there's a resistance going on. It's going on largely at the local level. And what that does, and I think Mike spoke to this earlier, is it creates the momentum and the conditions to replace the government, to change it from being a majority to a minority or not being in power at all in the 2022 elections. So all of these battles, there's one going on in Hamilton that hasn't been mentioned, and I'd like to throw a little bit in here on it. We are in the process of being forced by the provincial government to dramatically expand the size of the city onto the remaining farmland that we have that isn't already protected by the Greenbelt. This is rules that have been changed by the provincial government. They've torn up all the previous government rules and put in their own, and they are essentially dictating to the municipalities that you have to set aside land for the next 30 years of growth, because they predicted how many people are going to be here 30 years from now, which is quite a feat on their part, and that land has to be zoned before they lose power in 2022. So there's a big fight going on right now, initiated in Halton, Hamilton area, but going on in other parts of the province, where all the municipalities in the Greater Golden Horseshoe are being forced to go through this process of designating and bringing into their urban boundary lands that they allegedly will need to accommodate growth. And the climate crisis is specifically excluded from the rules. You can't talk about the climate crisis in terms of those growth planning rules. So Halton, a couple of weeks ago, unanimously passed a resolution saying we can't carry on a consultation about our growth plans in the middle of a pandemic. We're in a situation where people can't participate in that in a realistic way. People who are in the rural areas who don't have reasonable internet connections can't participate in online Zoom meetings. People who are low income and don't have computers can't participate. And there's a whole lot of people, and probably some of you are feeling this way, who are really having a lot of problems with Zoom as a process at all. So they passed a resolution asking the province to extend the deadlines until after the pandemic is over so that they can do the consultations. Hamilton Council, I think, is going to be looking at this later on this month. And it's happening in other areas as well. So yes, there's a provincial government, it has a majority and it gets to run things, but there's a whole lot of other governments. And one of them, one are at the municipal level, another one really are the conservation authorities. And I look at the attack on the conservation authorities as an attempt to defang one of the potential opposition forces to the provincial government. And as I said, the people who are sitting on those conservation authorities are not amused. And they include people who have run for the Conservatives in the past. And they're speaking out and saying, this is not acceptable. So I think the government may be, as Mike said, losing support in a number of areas that they might not have expected to lose support. So back to you, Alex.
Thanks so much. Sorry, Alex, you are totally welcome to control. I have one more question, but I'm not sure what our timing is looking like. So if necessary, we can wait until after we can close out, because I know there's some people that need to be as respectful to the hour as possible. I was going to mention that there's a bit going on in the conversation with Ria, one of our members of 350, about a document that's going to be made available. We've covered a lot of information in this webinar, so almost everything that we've talked about and some other awesome resources are going to be sent out to you guys in an email, just so if you didn't have a chance to copy it or whatever, it will be made available to you in a more accessible way. We have time for one more question, Alex, or would we like to close things off and move to the after meeting discussion for people who are able to stay around?
Steph, you know how many questions we have, so I'll leave that to you. I think folks may want a question, like a discussion, but if someone's been waiting those patiently for their question, you'll know.
It's me.
It is you. Go ahead, Katie.
Okay, I thought I should ask because it was a good segue from what Dawn said about how like it could be a good strategy to like. Can you hear me? Okay, yep. Yeah. A good strategy to get opposing forces to take down the province. So like, I just had a question about like, I was listening in on the Stratford like information, but I'm not super clear on it. Like, I don't know the details, but I was wondering like, what if the main reason for the mayor to be secretive and to be siding with the province was just for money. Like, was that just for money? And like, I was just wondering if that could be something that we might encounter in Hamilton, like with our council. And I just wanted to know if there was any more insight into why the mayor was so down for this going through. And then I had another point about like it feels like I know that this campaign or like this 350 push like for these webinars is about targeting the province, but I feel a little.
Okay, I'm not quite sure what happened to her there, but we did get through the first part of her question. So if any of the panelists want to answer that, it may seem obvious, but what was the goal of the mayor of Stratford besides money, or was it just money? Was it a recovery from the pandemic? What were jobs for his citizens? What was the goal there? And Mike, if you're comfortable.
I am. Yeah, the mayor went with Kathleen Wynne to China in 2017 to listen to the pitch from the glass plant developers. The glass plant developers didn't choose Stratford first. They chose Guelph Aramosa Township first. And then when that failed, they came to Stratford. And it is a follow the money exercise. I'm not suggesting that any councillors or the mayor were personally enriched by this, but they saw a giant factory paying taxes as being a win for the city, and that they wouldn't have to worry about taxes so much when they had a giant factory paying some taxes. The arable land that it was going to be on was originally in the township of Perth South. And Perth South, as are all the townships in Ontario, are facing ever reducing revenues from the province. The province has been cutting back on I believe it's an infrastructure amount of money that had been going to the municipalities, to the townships for many, many years. And now the province is cutting that off. And so the municipality was saying, where are we going to get money? So they cut a deal with the city of Stratford. They would get some of the tax revenue in return for giving Stratford the land. And the trouble, maybe that was a really good deal for everybody, except that nobody knew about it except a few councillors, because it was secret. And it was in 2018. It had nothing to do with pandemic. This was like 2.5 years ago. They got together with Xinyi and said, here's what we're going to cook up. And so there is a money trail. It has to do with taxation. It has to do with growth. But I don't think the people of Stratford wanted to be known as the glass capital of Canada. They want to be known as the theater capital of Canada, or one of the best Shakespearean festivals in the world. And I don't think that necessarily goes with being a glass capital.
Well, for sure. And of course, Perth County would certainly not want to be known as a glass factory either, of course, because as you were speaking about before, all the farming communities there, right? So I'm glad that they also got involved, because that seemed a little bit ridiculous. But now I'm extending this, so I apologize. If you have anything else you want to add, go ahead. Okay, lovely. Well, that's all the questions I had up front for the panel. I was trying to limit it to 3. So thank you so much, everyone, for all your questions. Thank you so much for all the chatting that was going on in the chat. That's awesome. A recorded version of this is going to be made available, and the chat, I believe, will also be made available, as well as that document that has all the links and pieces of information. So if you can keep up with everything, because I know I couldn't, it will be made available after this meeting. I'm going to turn it back over to Alex, but I believe we're going to go into a post-meeting discussion after this, but I will let Alex take that on because he knows much more about what's going on than I do. So, Alex?
Apparently I know what's going on. News to me and everyone else here. So yeah, this is my first time helping out with a 350 webinar. So all I'll say is I also had a great time. I know some folks are signing off. That's totally fine. Have a great night, and thank you for joining us. If you are interested in chatting with us, I think I should stop talking quite soon to allow that to happen. But I will just say it's been a real pleasure getting engaged in 350. And as one of the newer folks helping out with the CA Watch program and some of this other stuff, I really just want to make the pitch to all of you that there's a time commitment that makes sense. There's a project that makes sense. We saw how beautiful Beverly Swamp was. I think waiting to see if you can find some specific butterflies in that swamp sounds like a lovely way to pass a weekend with family. So I think there's ways to get engaged that are both meaningful and can work for you. So I'll leave that as my last pitch. And yeah, if folks want to get in, I think we'll try and keep this orderly because there's still about 3 dozen of us on the call. Maybe raise your hand or something like that. Yeah, if you can, or jump in, but try and be careful if someone else is talking.
Steph, you want me to try? I can see a few people, but only a few.
That's okay. I was just going to expand on what Alex was saying. Generally what we do at this time is we do raise our hands. You can either do so very literally this way, or if you know how to use the little raise your hand button like Brody's got going on right now, because he really like to say something. And I apologize, Brody, I muted you and you were ready to say something. My bad. And then we can move forward in that way. So I will do my best to keep it on everyone. If for some reason I don't see you and your hand's been up for a while, you are welcome to yell at me in the chat and be like, Steph, pay attention. And we'll just kind of have an open discussion here. There's no real specific categories. It's just whatever you're comfortable with. So we'll stop gabbing and let Brody say what he has to say, and then we'll move forward from there. Thanks again, everyone, for coming out tonight. Here we go.
Yeah, thank you, Steph and Alex, for all the effort you put in. I should have expressed it earlier before some of the people left, but to all of you who are still on the call, I did want to express, it's an honor to be here with all of you, and my sincere thanks for all of the effort that you're putting in each of your own ways. My hope too is that, I think one of the reasons for me doing this stuff is being inspired by everyone else who's doing it, all of you. And I think I've heard this before, you know, trying to find our bravery and like whatever that may be for each one of us, what it means to be brave in our own life and how we can do that. I think that that's something that I'm trying to work towards, and I'm inspired by all of you to do that, and I hope that I'm doing that for all of you and that we're doing that for one another. I'm gonna head out shortly, so yeah, I just wanted to express that before I did.
If I can add a little, I don't know, I think I'm unmuted. If I can add a little bit in terms of the thanks, certainly the folks from Stratford were a huge help, and Mike coming on the panel and being here for that was really helpful. The technical stuff that was done for the interviews, and I think we had a little difficulty, at least I was seeing a little difficulty in the way that came out, but that was a bandwidth issue, I think, rather than the work that was done to put this together. But John Kirk did a whole lot of background work to put those interviews together in a way that the interviews were twice the length that we actually were able to broadcast, and they came out great, and he was able to drop photos in and do all those kinds of things that I have no idea how to do. And you know, people in the background like Steph, just great stuff. So really happy to be part of this. Sorry that it got delayed a bit. That's why Jim's got his hand up there, I think.
We thought Doug Ford found you and deleted you.
Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah,
I can unmute.
Sorry, I just want to check in with Jim quickly because you have a question being asked as well. So if this is specific to what's going on right now, you go right ahead, but otherwise I'll check in with Lori. So.
Okay, I don't know if you're, I don't know if you're directing me to speak or someone else, but I'm just going to go ahead anyway. And I just want to say to everyone, I'm so sorry. I use these technologies all the time in my teaching, and somehow when I came into Zoom as the only person that could come in, and I came in the wrong way, and there was no, there were none of the boxes that they said on the internet I'd be able to use to open up the waiting room, and so everyone was trapped, and I was afraid that if I got out, I was afraid I'd shut the whole thing down and we'd be totally messed up. So I finally did go out and came back in, and there was the waiting room. And so I thought, well, we're not going to have any time ahead of this. I just let everyone in. So my apologies for that delay. That was all on me. But thanks for putting up with it.
Thanks, Jim. I figured that's along the lines of what you're going to say, so I thought you should go ahead before. Lori, I thought I saw your hand up. I'm not seeing it up anymore. So if you did have a question and you wanted to speak, you're more than welcome to now. But if you suddenly become muted, it's me just filtering out background noise. I mean, no disrespect. I see Stan has his hand up as well. So let's go, Lori, if you're up for it, Lori, and then we'll move on to Stan.
Hi, Steph. That was, it's Lori speaking. That was an accident. I don't have a question, sorry.
That's all right, Lori, no worries. So, are you wanting to make a comment on her not having a question, or can we go to Stan and come back? You first?
I just wanted to direct our attention to the woman on the screen who's got the label Richard Fitzpatrick. And I believe she's one of the vigil initiators and one of the ones who stood outside of Stratford City Hall for 36 days. Am I correct on that?
She is, I believe. I think she was telling me she's the woman in the picture.
Yeah.
By the lady holding the "We Won" sign. So yes, if I'm understanding that correctly, Leslie.
Congratulations.
Good work. Okay, so I'm not sure if I don't know if she's able to unmute herself or if she wants to make a comment.
She was wearing the wing.
Yes, she was wearing the wing. So very good work. Oh.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm Leslie, and it was Peggy and I that did the vigil, and we were trying to figure out. I had done a climate emergency vigil in the window of the Agora Art Gallery in early December, in conjunction with my photographic show. And so the idea came from that. And I asked Peggy, who's an actor, to advise me on that. So for 3 hours a night during that week, I wore my wings, and you couldn't see who I was, but I was in the window for climate emergency. So the vigil idea grew out of that. And Peggy and I were trying to figure out, well, what could we do, to support the fight against Xinyi? And finally, we just said, let's just start. So we went out, I think it was January 6th was our first day. And we went out 6 days a week. And of course, layers and layers and layers and signs. And we photographed to make sure that there was a post every day. We both posted on Facebook. And we also collected videos, because one of the projects that Tori Sutton was doing is she was putting a video presentation together from all these citizens saying no. And so we collected videos, and we educated. We found a scientist who was going to help us, who didn't know that this was going on, and he came up to ask what was going on. We told people where to get signs. We gave flyers. We only had a couple of rude people at us, but it kept the presence of the people in the fight when during that pause period when council could have thought we'd gone to sleep and we couldn't rally anymore because it was the deep lockdown. So we kind of, we're glad we don't have to put on layers and stand there, but we kind of miss it. Was Kathy C., one of the women, said it was the best party in town because in the middle of the lockdown, we could get together and we could share ideas and stories and information and news. And it was quite interesting to stand there at the heart of Stratford and watch the goings on, and meeting the people that were almost always there, the musician who would come out quite often and play, and got to see the same people sort of waiting for the buses almost every day. So it was quite a wonderful thing, and it ended up being very effective because, as I say, it was the sense of the strength of it was the personal sacrifice for the common good. And that has a kind of strength to it. And everybody who's fighting on the, for the planet, that's what you're doing. It's your personal sacrifice. It's your time, it's your effort, it's your energy, your presence for our common good of the planet. In the blackness of space, this is our home, right? So, and it's wonderful, the light of, Stratford, of course, has given hope to lots of communities in Stratford, but the light of it was to work with people, to see the, and all the citizens that worked on this, everybody contributed what their gifts were, what they could do, what they had. And because of that, we all threw it in together into this pot, and it worked. And to see that and to be part of that amazing people and group. I was kind of sorry to see that some of the community leaders did not join in on the fight in Stratford, people that we feel, like I feel, should have. So that was kind of surprising. You see who the real leaders are, I guess, in that way. But it was a wonderful thing. And Peggy and I, are very, very glad that we stood there every day. It had a magic to it as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us and explaining that, relating that, because it's more inspiration. And I think that's been part of the success of what we've done here tonight. Steph?
Absolutely. And that's one of the big things that we're trying to encourage is what you're talking about, Leslie, encouraging people within the community to come out and give in any way that they can, anytime that they can, to help in these kinds of situations. The thermometer that you used got a lot of feedback to us as being a nice visual and helpful. So someone, I think it might have been Sam, but someone asked in the
That was another group. That was another group. The artist, a gentleman from Climate Momentum, which helped push to get the climate resolution passed by City Council in Stratford. And Jen Menzel, who was an artist, and he would carry it down, whenever we were on vigil, and then the Agora Gallery let them leave it in their windows. So it was like all these different, it was surprising to see the people who did come to this fight. And you got to know a lot of new people and a respect for a lot of people, as well as people that I think should have been fighting this. But anyway, thank you for having me tonight.
No problem. And I'm just going to move on to Stan, because he did have his hand up, and I know he said he had a specific time period, but we can come back to that later if that timing works out. But for now, Stan, I just want to make sure that you can get your question in before you have to leave.
Oh,
Thanks so
actually,
much.
it was just a quick statement, and it's been mentioned a couple times here, but education is so vital, and documentation of everything. I think Alex even mentioned it. He started off this presentation, to all of us who theoretically know what's a conservation authority. I'll bet you can ask the general citizen out there, oh, we got to protect our conservation authorities. What do they do? Well, gee, I don't know. It's got to be written down in black and white. Maybe we need a climate change for dummies. What is climate change? What affects it? Why is this important? Why is what the Ford government doing wrong? It needs to be something like that for definitions from climate change, CAs, stewardship, conservation, preservation, all the way down to examples. What Leslie just said, that's got to be documented. Got to put out all the stops and say, you know what, you can fight the good fight. It's not just hard work. You can have fun at it too. Fighting for a good cause can be a nice social thing too. Pull out every kind of advantage you can and document it and spread it around. Get the Stratford initiatives. Set up a template as to how they beat the so-called done deal. There was something on the chat about the lack of empathy among the young people. I thought that's pretty scary because I'm sorry, Stephanie, go ahead.
No. I only have my hand up to follow up with what you're saying. So you go right ahead, and I will speak when you're done. No concern.
So, and I think Mike Sullivan mentioned it, transparent government, engaging at a citizenship, which means education, educate. I think what needs to happen is that this struggle has to take on the fervor of, let's say, a couple generations ago of anti-smoking. Let's say, hear me out. 40, 50 years ago, smoking was cool. You smoked and it was cool. Nowadays, you hardly see it anywhere. A couple times you see it. That kind of attitude, that desperation has to sink in. You know what? This is for the life of our planet, and people will think, oh, this is flippant. This is all, yeah, yada, yada. Show them proof, show what's happening with flooding. And even Hurricane Hazel, why CA started in the first place. It can happen again. So pull out all the stops and let the plane take off. And I was going somewhere with that, but I lost track. So I'll stop there. And before I go, I just got to say, thank you, everybody, for putting this on. This was great. I'm glad you're on the good side. So until next time, pleasant dreams.
That's so great, Stan. And all I was going to say is Mike Sullivan mentioned in the chat that they are working on writing a guidebook to how Stratford did it. I don't know if they're going to be including those kinds of definitions, but what I get from Mike's involvement and the community involvement is they'd be interested in hearing your feedback and what you might want. I can't speak for them, of course, so I apologize if that's incorrect.
This has to be sent province-wide, almost like a kit, including a video, interview. What Leslie said, oh my God, whatever she said there, that's got to be taped. Leslie, Order of Canada for you, my dear. Got it. And all of it, that's all got to be put in there, solidly packed in, and get it out there in some kind of maybe some kind of package that could go out to anybody, everybody who cares, and even those who don't care. They need to care. Okay,
Our
I'm
own
starting to preach now.
environmental
So-
survival kit.
Yes, there we go.
Absolutely, sure. And hey, if the great ideas don't come out of Stratford, I don't know where they do come from. Unfortunately, this is being recorded in case anyone didn't see that in the chat. So this will be
Oops.
available. No, it's okay. Leslie will be on tape saying what she said. So hey, who knows? Maybe she's going to get that order of Canada. You never know.
You know what? Stories like that are inspirational. Even if one person hears something like that and it inspires them to do something, it's worth it.
Absolutely.
Speaking of recording, I think just in case we want more interesting discussion, I'm going to stop the recording now so you can feel free to tell us what you really think.